From the early days of stats being implemented in Counter-Strike, which was originally with, I think, Gotfrag was the first one actually, where they had a stats database telling you how much ADR had been done, etc. Obviously, ESEA came along and people wanted to see the stats from their own pogs. And now we have HLTV.org keep stats for all the games. We've seen the gradual rise of stats-based analysis kind of almost taking over the industry. Now, not entirely, like it's not like people on desks are just running off only stats. It's not like all the best journalists are just running off stats, but we have seen a rise of using stats to be the metric by which we judge things. And it feels like people have become obsessed with concepts like HLTV.org rating and trying to analyze who performed better based on stats. I mean, we now even have MVP awards that are given out by some sites based on stats, or people try to draw large conclusions that are incredibly qualitative and subjective in nature, but based on like someone's stats over a whole year, or stats at majors, or stats on a particular map. And this is despite the fact that time and time again, we see performances where the stats actually tell us almost the opposite. Like, I've seen performances that Zipnix has had, the support player of Astralis, where he won so many clutches and he had so many key sort of anchoring kills on a round that either allowed someone to rotate or held together a strat that was falling apart. And then on the stats, he's either shown up as like very average or sometimes below average, and it wouldn't tell you from those numbers that he actually was the best player, or he was the most impactful player, or he had an incredibly large impact on that game. So one of the core problems I have with this issue is not the idea that stats can't tell you a lot more than they currently are doing, or that not the idea that someone couldn't come into the scene. I guess could not is double negative. It's not that we're going to be in a situation where this will always be the case. There certainly could be people who would be incredibly knowledgeable about stats, how they work, and the game, and could put it all together and provide something new and give us some new observations and food for thought at the very least, if not some solid metrics from which to actually base a new way of analyzing the game and thinking about how good players are and contrasting them and comparing them. The problem right now is pretty simply this. It's that there is nobody who is both an expert on statistics and analyzing and interpreting them, and CSGO as a game and the eye test and understanding the knowledge of the game, and therefore has the two overlapping kind of magisteriums, as it were, the two overlapping fields, and in the center they get the sweet spot where they can use both and really give us something of value. There is nobody like that. It's like I always used to say, the reason why a lot of frag movies really sucked in Counter-Strike 1.6 is you either had the people who were amazing at making movies, and all they did is spend their spare time getting better and better at making movies, effects, editing, etc., understanding bitrate, compression, and then you had the other group of people who knew what really good frags were, but were quite poor at making movies. And pretty much you saw movies tended to be split into those sets. There was very rarely ever the guy who was really sick at the editing and the technical side of movie making and had the knowledge to know which frags are worth putting in from which players, in what context, and therefore could make an amazing movie overall. That's why for me, someone who came along at the end of 1.6, Athid, was an absolute godsend. This guy really had both combined and did his homework in both respects. No, so instead we don't have these people. At the moment, what we have is a bunch of people who pretend to be experts in stats, how they're analysed, investigated, what metrics to use, and then pretend as though, because they also, a lot of them have the CSGO knowledge, that that's what they're doing is using the stats. Like I have, from my investigations, talking to people, studying them, seeing what they write, I have not found a single person who is that true expert in both regards. Now, what's funny about that is, I don't have an issue with that. In as much as people, I'm in favor at the moment, without having these advanced metrics, of using qualitative, subjective judgments to decide the game. The problem is these people do not admit as much, and therefore they get the general public to buy into a fallacious notion that they are basing everything on stats, and that's where they're getting all of their results. I actually, based on their opinions, do not think they are basing it entirely on stats. I can see where their subjective worldview and their own biases insert into it, but they don't acknowledge that and say this is what I think and the reason why. They use some stats, they use a stat line as sort of justification for that and make it seem like their knowledge came just from this like objective world of stats, and that they're somehow like, it's almost, they think it's like a religion, some science of like, well, I'm just using science here, bro. I'm not using like philosophy or any of that stuff. It's like, you're not in any way. You're still doing what everyone else is doing. You just find a stat that backs up what you wanted it to say. So like a classic one, for example, I've gone through this before in a video I made here about why stats don't mean that much, is they'll say, oh, well, look at these stats numbers for this guy winning 1v1s. And they'll find a really good player at 1v1s. And so you'll go, well, yeah, he's really good, right? What they don't mention is that there'll be a player who's like fourth on that list who we can all look at and watch his games and go, this guy's not good at 1v1s, but he has a really good record. So they ignore the ones that are convenient to ignore like that, yet they're the ones who worship stats. Now, the reason why I say that there's no one in this field who's an expert is because there's a few people, I've seen them on a few websites, I've seen a few on Unicorn, websites like that, where they clearly have done a lot of work in stats and research, and etc. And I saw a guy come along at the end of last year who published an analysis of the biases of which side won on all the competitive maps over the year. Now, some of these people suggest, based on what talking to some of them and reading some of their stuff, it does seem as though they have the background in stats, like they know something about that field, and so they've applied their knowledge there. Their problem is a lot of them came in the last year and a half, and don't have the fundamental Counter-Strike background. They don't understand the dynamics of the game as much, and they definitely don't understand the way the scene evolves, and therefore the context on the data. So they're running huge data sets and coming to conclusions which don't really work if you know a few simple things about Counter-Strike, which I'll go into because there's a great example of this, which is like map bias and map pools, which I can get into in a minute. Now, those people do seem to come from the stats world, but as I said, they lack the CSGO knowledge. Now, most of the people who a lot of fans will probably present as the stats experts actually have some of the CS knowledge. They actually, if you talk to them, some of them could be analysts, could be experts. Certainly in terms of as a fan who's watched for a long time and thought about the game a lot and read interviews and talked to players and studied the game and maybe other sports, they have that basis. That's an area they're quite good in. But again, my problem is they are going under the guise of being the stats guy. Oh, I'm an expert because I've studied stats for 10 years, whatever it might be. Or I've looked at every stat from every game here and I've run the numbers and I've compared them and I've adjusted the formula. These are the guys who are the fakes, essentially. They're posers because, as I said, they don't have the stats background. Like, here's the thing. Spending 10 years studying the stats of 1.6 in CSGO will not make you an expert on statistics, because statistics is not something that was invented in esports and CSGO. Statistics is an actual field. It's like a subfield of mathematics. It's an element of mathematics. So as a result, someone who wants to be an expert either must be a layman who self-teaches himself, some autodidact who becomes incredibly good over the years reading books about stats, maybe taking small courses, learning about how all the different formulas and equations work and getting to a high level, then applying it to esports. Or goes through formal education, gets a degree in statistics, studies a bunch of modules in it, actually goes and takes courses and maybe has a job that revolves around it. These people, I would understand if they came in and then had the CSGO knowledge, they could be the ultimate person. The problem is these stats experts we have at the moment actually know incredibly little about stats as a field. They understand what a stat is in theory, but they don't actually understand the mathematical mechanisms that govern these things. And one of the ways I know that is because they make incredibly deep, broad generalizations about a very small sample size. See, this whole area of sample size, okay, is a very confused area because actually there is no set amount. But you might have heard that a famous number, I looked this up, people often quote as like a magic number is the idea of 30. Like you should do an experiment 30 times, you should have 30 pieces of data. And the real reason for this is it's not that once you have 30, you can stop and that's it. It's the idea that once you get to 30, I've seen it said as 28 elsewhere. Once you get to around 28 to 30, now you can at least stop referring to your sample size as small in most cases. Obviously, it depends what we're studying at this point in time. But at that point, you at least are starting to get a decent sample size and you might iron out some of the irregularities of like a real big outlier throwing off your whole sample size if you had only 5 as your sample size instead of 30, for example. Now, the reason why I bring this up is because, and by the way, if you're actually going to really study this, if you're an expert in stats, you wouldn't even go with that. That's like the beginner's basics, which, by the way, these stats experts don't use. And you'd start with that as a basis, but actually you do a power analysis to find out what sort of metric we should have, depending on which stat line we're talking about and what the context of it is and how much data we got coming in. Then you'd find out what the real number should be for each of them, and you'd get pretty close to having some good results. But the problem is, I actually think this needing about 30 or so, if we take it as a general rule, shows how idiotic the application of stats in a pure manner is in terms of trying to make objective judgments based on them. Because if you go for a single tournament, there is not going to be a team or a player who has 30 instances of a map being played. They're not even going to play 30 maps, all maps combined. Like, very often in a game, they won't even play 30 rounds. And yet people are drawing these strong conclusions from a game, from a series, from a tournament even. And yet a tournament is very few. I mean, someone can win a tournament sometimes by playing 8 to 10 maps. Some of those might even be blowouts. Someone can win a tournament by playing a map 3 times, playing some maps once. It's very hard to take anything from these single tournaments. And yet that's what people are doing with this style of analysis. So they don't understand the basics of stats themselves and don't understand sample size. They're applying statistical methods, but to sample sizes that are too small. And then their confidence level is too high for what they can then take from that particular method. So an example of where even actual expert stats guys who come in and try and do this use of correct sample size, a flaw of what they do, I think actually, is that they apply it and they follow the rules and actually find a good sample size and they get a really good one. And their problem is they don't understand the difference. Like the difference is, there are 2 areas here. One is map pool, how strong a team's map pool is. Second would be biases on maps. Now, the reason why I give these 2 as an example is people who are really good at maths here, yeah, if you want to do the sample size on how good a team is. So let's say Na'Vi in 2016. We want to know how good was Na'Vi on Train. Obviously one of their best maps for the whole year. Now, if you took all of their results in 2016... right, first of all, if you were an absolute noob who didn't know much about CSGO, you already have fucked up there because we all know that as soon as Simple joins the team, well, now the stats need to be changed, right? Because Simple's in the team, that's very different, he's a massive outlier as an individual player in terms of the difference of what your team's going to be like with Simple and without Simple. So most of us would say, right, well, take that part and make that separate. Make it Na'Vi from the beginning of 2016 before Simple joined. Take that period of time, right? Even then, with all those train games, it'll be quite a lot. Even if there was 30, because obviously counting online games, they definitely will be. But even on LAN, let's say, I don't know if they'd actually be fully up to 30 at that point in time, but let's say there was close to that. Now, even then, you can't really just look at the stats of Train at that point in time, right? Because the problem is the meta game of how Train is played changed over the year. That's why it was amazing SK was managed to stay on top for so long on Train. The metagame of the map changed. The number of teams who are willing to play Na'Vi on Train changed. The teams who banned Train against Na'Vi changed. So as a result, that data doesn't actually necessarily tell you how good Na'Vi was at different points in time. There could be times where their stats went down, but that's because they were amazing and there were a couple of other teams like SK, like VP, who were willing to play them on it. In other eras, maybe people just banned Train against Na'Vi and played them on a cobblestone or something. See, this is key information that the pure stats guy couldn't know. Likewise, map pool bias. This is a really big problem. Map side bias, rather. I saw this study, and on the surface, it looked interesting, right? Oh, let's see from all the competitive games how CT biased is Cash. The problem with that is, yes, massive sample size again, but first of all, maps changed in terms of the meta over the year. If you remember, in 2015, Cash went from being super CT-sided to like reasonably medium to at one point being T-sided towards the end of the year. Like the maps can change quite radically. And so not knowing that, you're judging all of them together and you're taking it all into account. So here's what's funny. If it had gone from being really CT-sided to really T-sided, and at the end of the year you ran an average and somehow it came out as the middle, like, oh, actually teams win 50-50. That wouldn't tell you anything about any actual game of Cash that took place. If at one point in time it was CT-sided and then later it was just T-sided and it was never in the middle. You see the flaw there with trying to apply the stats like that? Then you've got to add into the equation the fact that we all know that the general bias for a map, if Scrubs are playing it, is different from the best team in the world playing it. When a team like SK Gaming played on Train, they could make Train very CT-sided. And yet, other really good teams on Train, Virtus.pro, Na'Vi, were winning from the T side. Meanwhile, you go and find some very, very low-level teams, and they make the game very CT-sided because they're not very good on the T side of Train. And yet at the elite level, the only team making it massively CT-sided is SK Gaming. You see what I mean? The context as well. You can't take like the top 100 teams to play, the top 50 teams to play, because the way that the top 5 teams play can be so very different from the rest. Now, yes, if you want to say map bias in that sense for all teams, if you took a month of people playing Train and you took the top 50 clans, you might actually find a good competitive sense for what the biases are. That might be a way to apply the context. The problem is, if you're then going to say, well, since the map's CT-sided, and then you're going to talk about an SK Gaming like August of 2016 game, you're going to be incredibly wrong about the meta of how those stats will apply to that game, because it won't be T-sided in that particular sense. So if stats were as good as these people who currently like peddle them at the moment and constantly press the issue implied, then here's the great thing. We'd find these real applications whereby they could use them to be great predictors of the future and know what was going to happen. And teams especially would apply them and be much more successful. And the teams that used the stats would in general be more successful than the ones that didn't, and it would catch on and it would become a big thing. Right now, most of these stats are giving us trivia or can suggest questions or pose some sort of a problem, like how do we resolve this that we think this when the stats say this. But ultimately, it's always coming down to us to answer them. It's coming down to the expert, the person who studied the game a lot, thought about the game a lot, looked at the actual subjective aspects of what happened around beyond the numbers. It always comes down to that person to provide answers, suggestions, possible theories that they can come up with based on stats, because obviously you need some evidence for theories. Now, what's funny is, this is one of the great flaws of sports. They've gone to an incredibly deep level in some sports on stats. And even then, you run into these weird anomalies of people who obviously aren't that good, but the stats say they're better than they are. Or scenarios where some of the stats tell you that one team should win, but then in the game they don't. There are flaws in this sense. With that said, in sports, because they've got the actual thing I'm telling you, the marriage of a real stats expert and one who also has followed the game and knows it on a deep level, or those people working together, you have got areas where it's improved the game. That's the reason why in the modern NBA, it's become a small ball league. And you have all these teams where you have players shooting 7, 8 3-point field goals a game in a scenario where even the best 3-point field goal player back in, let's say, 1996, maybe shot like 4 or 5 of those in a game. The reason why is they've shown statistically that with the really good shooters, really high percentages, you can scale it up, and it does scale. You can go to that level and be amazing. And as a result, you have all these great 3-point shooters who are scoring like 18 points, and they're mainly just shooting threes. Likewise, defensively, the whole NBA has been transformed. Obviously, NFL is a good example of this as well, where you look statistically where the routes are to run and where to block people and where to make it more difficult. And as a result, you emphasize their weaknesses and your own strengths. I would actually say, even in CSGO, a good example of someone who'd used stats that seemed to help him was actually Device, star player of Astralis, where he said he studied the heat maps of himself to figure out where to be more unpredictable, and also in general to have a sense of where to look for where his enemies are going to be, where their favorite spots are, so that he can set up. And I think you can see that something of a proof that worked in his case, because he went from being one of the best hybrid AWPers to flat out being one of the best AWPers in the whole world, and particularly on Overpass, one of Astralis' specialist maps at the moment, where he is so incredible and know how to set up those shots on the A side, on CT and T side, and have a sense of where people will be, where they'll come from, where they'll want to set up. And as a result, he can out-AWP players who, as traditional AWPers, were better pure primary AWPers than he's supposed to be. So one day, I think these people will exist. The true experts in both regards, or there'll be good teams that combine the two. I suspect this will be the case, and at the very least they will support analysts and this sort of expertise to make it more valuable. But at the moment it doesn't exist, and I just find it a bit disingenuous when people suggest it does, because some of these people who think they're stats experts are not even experts in the field of stats. They don't understand the basic techniques applied, how you formulate equations. They don't understand even the basics of this area, yet they're pretending to be, and yet it's a real area that you've got to study if you want to be an expert in that respect.